The day everything unraveled did not announce itself with thunder or sirens, but with the quiet confidence of routine, the kind of ordinary afternoon that feels too small to matter until it becomes the pivot point of an entire life. Our neighborhood had always been marketed as peaceful, the kind of place where trimmed hedges and matching mailboxes were supposed to signal order and stability, but beneath that carefully curated surface lived an HOA that thrived on control more than community. For months, the tension had been building in small, almost forgettable ways. Notices taped to doors for grass that was a half-inch too tall, warnings sent by certified mail about approved paint shades that differed only in name, passive-aggressive emails about trash cans being visible for 10 minutes longer than allowed. Each infraction was documented, logged, and weaponized, creating a constant low hum of anxiety that never quite faded. On that particular afternoon, the air felt heavier than usual, not because of the weather but because of a familiar sense that something was about to be made an example of, and as usual, that example was going to be us. The reason was almost laughably minor, a supposed violation related to a temporary work vehicle parked in our driveway, something we had already cleared weeks earlier, but the HOA president, a woman whose authority seemed fueled by indignation rather than bylaws, had decided that compliance was no longer enough. She wanted spectacle, validation, and the unmistakable satisfaction of being obeyed. When she stormed across the street, her posture rigid and her expression sharpened by rehearsed outrage, it was clear that she had escalated beyond letters and fines. This time, she had called the police, framing the situation as an urgent threat to order, a dangerous act of defiance that required immediate intervention. As the patrol car rolled in, its presence alone drew the attention of neighbors who peeked through blinds and paused mid-chore, the silent audience that always accompanied these moments. The HOA president wasted no time, gesturing wildly and filling the space with her certainty that the law was on her side, that authority flowed naturally to those who demanded it loudly enough. The officer listened, nodded, and approached with the neutral professionalism expected of someone used to sorting through neighborhood disputes that rarely matched the urgency described. I stood there, feeling the familiar frustration of being treated like a problem rather than a person, while my wife remained calm, her stillness almost unsettling in contrast to the chaos unfolding around us. She had seen this pattern before, the way power was often assumed rather than earned, and she understood that moments like these were less about facts and more about who controlled the narrative. The HOA president's confidence grew with every second, emboldened by the uniform beside her, convinced that the final act of authority was about to be delivered in her favor. Yet there was something she could not anticipate, something buried beneath the surface of this ordinary dispute, something that would soon disrupt the script she had written in her mind. My wife reached into her bag with deliberate precision, not as a defensive gesture, but as a quiet preparation, the kind that comes from knowing exactly when a line has been crossed. The officer's attention shifted, curiosity flickering briefly as he observed the change in posture, the subtle recalibration of the moment. The neighborhood held its breath, unaware that the balance of power was about to tilt in a way that none of them, especially the HOA president, could have imagined. What began as another attempt to assert control was now teetering on the edge of revelation, and as my wife brought her identification into view, the foundations of that carefully constructed authority began to crack, setting the stage for a confrontation that would ripple far beyond that driveway and into the very heart of the HOA grip on the community, a confrontation that would only deepen as the truth behind her credentials started to come into focus in the next chapter. The shift in the officer's demeanor was subtle at first, the kind of change that only becomes obvious in hindsight. But it marked the moment when the story stopped following the HOA president's expectations and began carving its own path. As my wife held out her identification, there was no rush, no defensive energy, just a quiet certainty that contrasted sharply with the agitation still radiating from across the driveway. The officer's eyes dropped to the card, and in that instant, the practiced neutrality he had carried into the situation gave way to something heavier, something that suggested recognition layered with caution. It was not the reaction of someone surprised by a clever trick or a fake credential, but the unmistakable pause of someone encountering authority that existed outside the narrow frame of a neighborhood dispute. The air seemed to thicken as seconds stretched longer than they should have, and even the distant sounds of lawn equipment and passing cars faded into insignificance. The HOA president continued to project confidence, still operating under the assumption that this was merely a formality before the inevitable enforcement she had demanded. But her certainty was built on the belief that she was the high-ranking force in the moment, a belief that was now quietly unraveling. The officer adjusted his stance, his posture no longer angled toward enforcement, but toward assessment, as though the situation had shifted from routine complaint to something that required a different set of considerations. My wife remained composed, her expression unchanged, embodying the kind of restraint that comes from familiarity with scrutiny and consequence. She had not raised her voice or made a spectacle of herself, and that restraint itself carried weight, signaling that this was not her first encounter with authority or conflict. Around us, neighbors who had initially been drawn by the novelty of flashing lights and perceived drama began to sense that the story they had anticipated was not unfolding as expected. The usual pattern was predictable: a citation issued, a lecture delivered, and a quiet retreat by the accused under the watchful eyes of the community. This time, however, the rhythm was off, and even those observing from a distance could feel it. The officer glanced up briefly, his gaze flicking from my wife to the HOA president and back again, as though recalibrating his understanding of who held legitimate standing in this exchange. The HOA president's energy shifted as well, though she did not yet recognize it for what it was. Her gestures became sharper, her insistence louder, a reflexive escalation driven by the instinct to regain control when it begins to slip away. She reiterated the alleged violations with renewed intensity, framing them as clear, cut offenses that demanded immediate action, but her words now floated in the air without the anchoring effect they once had. The officer listened, but his attention was divided, his mind clearly working through implications that had nothing to do with driveway parking or HOA bylaws. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when the power dynamic inverted, when the authority the HOA president had summoned was no longer fully aligned with her agenda. My wife's identification, still visible, had introduced a new context, one that placed this encounter within a broader framework of jurisdiction, professionalism, and accountability. The officer's training was evident in the way he slowed the interaction, asking clarifying questions not to challenge but to understand, to ensure that any action taken would be appropriate and defensible. The HOA president, sensing resistance where she expected obedience, doubled down, her frustration bleeding through the polished veneer she usually maintained. She framed the situation as one of disorder, of rules being ignored, of a community under threat from those who refused to comply, but the narrative rang hollow in the face of the officer's measured response. It became increasingly clear that this was no longer a simple matter of enforcing HOA preferences through municipal authority. The presence of my wife's credentials had transformed the situation into one where missteps could carry consequences beyond an uncomfortable conversation. The neighbors' curiosity shifted into something closer to unease, as whispers spread and phones were discreetly raised, the unspoken understanding that whatever happened next would not remain contained to this block. The officer's body language communicated restraint and respect, signaling that he was aware of the potential ramifications of the moment, and that awareness stood in stark contrast to the HOA president's growing agitation. She had built her influence on the assumption that calling the police was the ultimate escalation, the final card that guaranteed compliance, and she was unprepared for the reality that not all authority operates on the same axis. As the minutes passed, the imbalance became harder to ignore, and the tension shifted from whether we would be reprimanded to how the HOA president would respond to the realization that her strategy had backfired. The officer's focus returned to my wife, his expression now one of recognition tempered by professionalism. And in that quiet exchange, the foundations of the HOA unchecked control were beginning to crack. What had started as an attempt to assert dominance was evolving into a moment of exposure, one that threatened to reveal not just procedural overreach, but a pattern of behavior that thrived on intimidation rather than legitimacy. The stage was set for consequences that extended far beyond that afternoon, consequences that would force everyone involved to confront the limits of their authority. And as the officer prepared to take the next step, it was clear that the real conflict was only just beginning, poised to escalate in ways that the HOA president had never anticipated, carrying the story into a far more consequential phase in the next chapter. What followed was not an explosion, but a tightening, a careful drawing inward of the moment as the officer chose deliberation over impulse, and that choice alone altered the trajectory of the entire encounter. He stepped slightly aside, creating space that had not existed before, and in doing so signaled that this was no longer a public performance staged for the HOA president's benefit. The questions he began to ask were calm, precise, and procedural, the kind designed not to accuse or defend but to document, and each one chipped away at the certainty that had fueled the call in the first place. The HOA president continued to posture, repeating phrases about community standards and violations, but her words now collided with the reality that they were being weighed rather than accepted. My wife's composure remained unchanged, a steady presence that contrasted sharply with the mounting agitation across the driveway, and that contrast itself began to tell a story that no one needed to verbalize. The officer's attention moved deliberately between the alleged infraction and the documentation presented, and it became clear that he was no longer viewing the situation through the narrow lens of a complaint, but through the broader framework of responsibility and oversight. He requested clarification on the HOA authority to involve law enforcement in what appeared to be a civil matter, and that single pivot reframed everything. The question was not hostile, but it was incisive, and it forced the HOA president to defend a position she had never expected to justify. Her confidence faltered as she referenced bylaws and agreements that sounded authoritative in meetings, but lacked the weight she assumed they carried in the presence of a uniform bound by statutes rather than neighborhood rules. The neighbors watching from a distance sensed the shift as well, the collective energy changing from anticipation of punishment to curiosity about accountability. The officer's demeanor communicated that he was no longer there to enforce an HOA directive, but to ensure that his presence was warranted at all, and that distinction mattered more than any fine or warning ever could. My wife's credentials remained part of the equation, not as a threat or a badge of superiority, but as context, a reminder that this interaction existed within a network of professional standards that extended beyond the cul-de-sac. The HOA president attempted to regain control by escalating her rhetoric, framing the situation as a test of authority, insisting that failure to act would undermine order, but the strategy only highlighted the fragility of her position. The officer listened, but his responses grew increasingly neutral, his language careful, his tone signaling that he was documenting not just the complaint, but the conduct surrounding it. There was a moment when he asked for written documentation of prior notices and approvals, and the pause that followed spoke volumes. What had been presented as a clear pattern of noncompliance now appeared riddled with assumptions and selective enforcement, and that realization hung in the air like a quiet verdict. My wife's calm presence served as an anchor, preventing the situation from devolving into the kind of spectacle the HOA president seemed to crave, and in doing so, it denied her the emotional leverage she relied on. The officer's questions continued, touching on timelines, permissions, and the rationale for involving police rather than pursuing civil remedies, and with each answer, the narrative of urgency weakened. The neighbors' attention sharpened, their earlier judgment giving way to the recognition that they were witnessing something rare, the limits of HOA power being tested in real time. The officer's posture remained professional, but there was an undercurrent of caution now, an awareness that missteps here could reflect poorly not just on him, but on the system he represented. He made it clear that his role was not to enforce HOA rules unless a clear violation of law was present, and that clarification alone drained much of the authority the HOA president had summoned. Her insistence that the situation warranted arrests began to sound less like a demand and more like an overreach, a reaction born of frustration rather than legal grounding. My wife's identification, once the silent disruptor, now became a stabilizing force, reminding everyone involved that accountability flowed in multiple directions. The officer took notes, his pen moving steadily as he recorded details that would not disappear when the patrol car left, and that permanence introduced a new kind of tension. The HOA president's voice wavered as she realized that this interaction might not end with her triumphant vindication, but with questions about her conduct and decision-making. The balance of power had shifted decisively, not through confrontation, but through scrutiny, and the effect was unmistakable. The officer concluded this phase of the interaction by explaining the limits of his involvement, emphasizing that no immediate action would be taken against us, and that any further disputes would need to be addressed through appropriate civil channels. The words landed with quiet finality, signaling the end of the performance the HOA president had orchestrated. As he prepared to disengage, it became clear that the consequences of this encounter would not be confined to that afternoon. The documentation, the witnesses, and the acknowledgement of overreach had set something in motion, something that would continue to unfold long after the patrol car drove away. The HOA president stood frozen in the aftermath, her authority diminished in the eyes of those who had once deferred to it, and as the officer took a final glance at my wife's credentials before returning them, the weight of what had transpired settled in. This was no longer just about a driveway or a vehicle. It was about exposure, about the thin line between governance and intimidation, and as the crowd slowly dispersed, the realization took hold that the real reckoning was still ahead, waiting to surface in ways that would reshape the neighborhood's understanding of power in the chapters to come. The patrol car's departure did not bring relief so much as it left behind a vacuum, an uncomfortable silence that settled over the driveway and stretched across the street, filling the spaces where certainty once lived. The HOA president remained rooted in place for a moment, her posture rigid, as if movement itself would acknowledge that the outcome had not gone according to plan. Neighbors lingered longer than they normally would, pretending to tidy lawns or check mail while absorbing the implications of what they had just witnessed. The usual hierarchy had been disrupted, and even those who had never been targets of HOA scrutiny felt the tremor of it. My wife stood beside me, unhurried, her calm presence signaling that this moment was not an anomaly but a consequence, the natural result of authority meeting its limits. The HOA president eventually retreated, her steps quick and clipped, a silent acknowledgement that the spectacle she had orchestrated had collapsed under its own weight. Yet the encounter did not end with her departure. It merely shifted arenas, moving from the driveway into inboxes, group chats, and whispered conversations that spread through the neighborhood with remarkable speed. By evening, the story had already begun to mutate, stripped of context and reshaped to serve different anxieties. But one fact remained stubbornly intact. The police had not enforced the HOA demand, and that alone unsettled the foundation on which so much control had been built. The next morning brought the first ripple of official response, a carefully worded email from the HOA board that framed the incident as a misunderstanding while subtly reinforcing expectations of compliance. The tone was measured but defensive, an attempt to reassert authority without directly acknowledging that it had been challenged. My wife read it without reaction, her familiarity with institutional language allowing her to recognize the telltale signs of damage control. She understood that this was the opening move in a longer game, one where perception mattered almost as much as procedure. Over the following days, notices appeared with renewed frequency, targeting minor issues with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as though the HOA believed that doubling down would restore the fear it had momentarily lost. Yet the effect was the opposite. Residents who had once complied quietly began to question, to ask for clarification, to request documentation, emboldened by the knowledge that the HOA authority was not absolute. Conversations that once happened behind closed doors now took place openly, fueled by a growing sense that the rules were being enforced selectively and that intimidation had replaced fairness. My wife's role in this shift remained largely invisible, not because it was insignificant, but because she understood the value of restraint. She did not broadcast her credentials or insert herself into every discussion. Instead, she observed, documented, and waited, allowing patterns to reveal themselves organically. The HOA president, meanwhile, struggled to maintain composure in public settings, her meetings marked by shorter tempers and a noticeable defensiveness whenever questions arose about procedure or enforcement. It became clear that the encounter with the officer had unsettled her more deeply than she would ever admit, planting doubt where certainty once reigned. As the weeks passed, the tension crystallized into something more formal when a special assessment notice arrived, citing vague justifications and demanding payment within an unreasonably short time frame. The move was transparent, an attempt to reassert control through financial pressure, and it backfired almost immediately. Residents compared notices and discovered inconsistencies that were impossible to ignore, discrepancies that suggested not oversight but intent. My wife began to organize information quietly, compiling timelines, cross-referencing bylaws, and noting deviations with the meticulousness of someone accustomed to accountability. She did not frame this as a battle, but as an audit, a systematic examination of practices that thrived in the absence of scrutiny. The HOA board's response to growing dissent was to convene an emergency meeting, advertised as an opportunity for transparency, but structured to limit participation and control the narrative. The room was tense, filled with residents who had never spoken publicly before, but now felt compelled to voice concerns that had simmered for years. The HOA president attempted to steer the discussion, leaning on procedural language and appeals to order, but her authority felt thinner, her words less persuasive. My wife attended without fanfare, blending into the crowd, her presence unremarkable to those who did not know the significance of it. As questions mounted and answers faltered, it became increasingly clear that the HOA governance rested on habits rather than adherence to its own rules. The meeting ended without resolution, but the damage was done. Trust, once eroded quietly, had now fractured openly, and the board's attempts to mend it only highlighted the cracks. In the days that followed, a formal complaint was filed with the appropriate oversight body, citing documented instances of overreach and selective enforcement. The filing did not name individuals, focusing instead on practices, a deliberate choice that underscored its seriousness. The HOA president's reaction was swift and personal, her frustration spilling into emails that grew increasingly unprofessional, betraying the strain she was under. Neighbors who had once deferred to her now viewed her actions through a different lens, interpreting insistence as insecurity and authority as performance. My wife continued to document, aware that the true test of accountability often came not in the initial exposure, but in the sustained examination that followed. The neighborhood's atmosphere changed subtly but unmistakably, the air of quiet compliance replaced by cautious engagement. People began to attend meetings regularly, to request records, to question decisions that had once gone unchallenged. The HOA grip loosened not through rebellion but through participation, a shift that redefined what community governance could look like. As the oversight process moved forward, the HOA board found itself under scrutiny it could not deflect with emails or fines, and the realization set in that the driveway incident had been a catalyst rather than an anomaly. What began as an attempt to assert dominance had triggered a chain reaction, exposing vulnerabilities that could no longer be ignored. The stage was set for consequences that would extend beyond fines and meetings, consequences that would force a reckoning with the very structure of authority within the neighborhood. And as the first official response from the oversight body loomed on the horizon, it became clear that the story was far from over, poised to deepen into something that would reshape not just rules but relationships in the chapters ahead. The first official response from the oversight body arrived not with drama but with gravity, its language careful and deliberate, signaling that the concerns raised were being taken seriously. The letter outlined an initial review, requesting documentation, timelines, and explanations for several enforcement actions that had been flagged as potentially inconsistent with the HOA governing documents. For many residents, this was the first tangible confirmation that the system they had long felt powerless against was, in fact, subject to review. The HOA board attempted to frame the inquiry as routine, a standard procedural check that required nothing more than cooperation. But the shift in their tone betrayed a deeper unease. Meetings became more frequent and less controlled. Agendas grew longer, and the once confident assurances about compliance and authority were replaced by hedged statements and calls for patience. My wife watched this unfold with quiet focus, understanding that scrutiny had a way of amplifying truths that had been easy to ignore when unexamined. The HOA president's behavior grew increasingly erratic, her attempts to maintain control oscillating between rigid enforcement and performative transparency, neither of which addressed the underlying issues. She circulated memos emphasizing the importance of unity and order, framing dissent as disruptive rather than constructive, a tactic that only deepened the divide. Residents who had once avoided conflict now found themselves exchanging documents, sharing experiences, and discovering patterns that painted a troubling picture of selective enforcement and personal vendettas. The sense of isolation that had kept them compliant for years began to dissolve, replaced by a cautious solidarity rooted in shared experience. My wife's role remained largely behind the scenes, her efforts focused on ensuring that information was accurate, organized, and presented without emotion. She knew that credibility would be the deciding factor, that the most effective challenge to authority was not outrage but evidence. As the oversight body's inquiries expanded, they began to request explanations for decisions that had never before been questioned, forcing the HOA board to confront its own inconsistencies. The HOA president's responses grew defensive, her language increasingly personal, a departure from the procedural tone she once wielded so effectively. In private conversations, she expressed frustration at what she perceived as a loss of respect, failing to recognize that respect could not be demanded, only earned. The pressure of scrutiny exposed fractures within the board itself, as members who had long deferred to her leadership began to distance themselves, wary of being associated with practices now under review. Meetings that once ended with unanimous votes now dragged on, marked by hesitation and quiet dissent. The neighborhood's atmosphere shifted again, this time from cautious engagement to active involvement, as residents realized that participation was not just permitted but necessary. Requests for financial records, enforcement logs, and correspondence flooded the HOA inbox, each one a reminder that transparency was no longer optional. The board struggled to keep pace, its administrative capacity strained by the sudden demand for accountability. My wife observed the strain with measured detachment, aware that systems built on control rather than cooperation often faltered under the weight of their own complexity. The HOA president attempted to regain narrative control by hosting a town hall, positioning herself as a mediator rather than an enforcer, but the effort rang hollow. Questions were met with vague answers, and assurances lacked substance, fueling skepticism rather than trust. The oversight body's presence loomed over every exchange, an unspoken reminder that the stakes had changed. Residents who had once feared retaliation now spoke openly, emboldened by the knowledge that their concerns were being heard beyond the confines of the neighborhood. The HOA president's authority, once unquestioned, now felt provisional, contingent on outcomes she could not dictate. As weeks passed, the review deepened into a formal investigation, its scope widening to include financial practices and governance procedures. The board's attempts to downplay the process were undercut by the steady accumulation of evidence, each document reinforcing the narrative of overreach and inconsistency. My wife continued to compile and cross-reference, her methodical approach ensuring that nothing was left to interpretation. She understood that accountability was rarely swift, that meaningful change often emerged from prolonged examination rather than dramatic confrontation. The emotional toll of the process became apparent as tensions flared in meetings and communications grew increasingly strained. The HOA president's frustration manifested in sharp emails and abrupt decisions, actions that only added to the record being reviewed. Board members began to resign quietly, citing personal reasons, their departures further destabilizing the organization. The neighborhood watched as the once monolithic authority of the HOA fragmented, its influence eroded by transparency and collective engagement. The oversight body's updates, though sparse, reinforced the seriousness of the situation, each acknowledgement a validation of the concerns raised. For the first time, residents began to imagine a future in which governance was collaborative rather than coercive, a possibility that felt both liberating and uncertain. My wife remained grounded, aware that the outcome would shape not just rules but relationships, and that the process itself was as important as its conclusion. As the investigation moved toward a critical phase, with findings expected in the coming weeks, the HOA president found herself isolated, her strategies exhausted and her authority diminished. The neighborhood stood at a crossroads, the old order unraveling, and a new, undefined structure waiting to take its place. What began as a routine call had evolved into a reckoning that challenged assumptions about power and accountability, and as anticipation built around the impending findings, it was clear that the story was entering a decisive chapter, one that would test whether exposure alone was enough to bring lasting change in the chapters yet to unfold. The findings arrived quietly, without ceremony, but their impact reverberated through the neighborhood with a force no shouting match ever could. The oversight body's report was thorough, methodical, and unsparing in its analysis, outlining patterns of selective enforcement, procedural violations, and financial ambiguities that could no longer be dismissed as misunderstandings. It did not rely on dramatic language or moral judgment. Instead, it presented facts in a way that made denial impossible. For residents who had lived under the HOA shadow for years, reading the report felt like exhaling after holding their breath for far too long. The HOA board's initial response was predictably restrained, a carefully crafted statement acknowledging the findings while emphasizing a commitment to improvement. But the restraint could not mask the gravity of what had been revealed. The report recommended corrective actions, mandated oversight, and outlined potential consequences if compliance was not achieved, shifting the balance of power decisively away from the board. The HOA president's name appeared repeatedly, not as a target but as a constant presence in decisions now deemed problematic, and that association proved impossible to ignore. Meetings became strained affairs, marked by an undercurrent of reckoning that no agenda could suppress. Residents attended in greater numbers than ever, their presence less tentative, their questions sharper, informed by documentation rather than suspicion. The HOA president attempted to maintain composure, framing the findings as an opportunity for growth, but her words rang hollow against the backdrop of documented overreach. Board members who had once supported her leadership now faced a choice between loyalty and responsibility, and the tension between those priorities was evident in every exchange. My wife observed these developments with a steady focus, aware that moments like this often invited emotional reactions that could derail progress. She understood that accountability was not about humiliation but about correction, and that the true measure of change lay in what followed. The oversight body's involvement intensified, requiring regular updates and adherence to specific reforms, effectively placing the HOA under a level of scrutiny it had never experienced. The administrative burden exposed weaknesses in the board's structure, revealing how much had relied on informal authority rather than transparent process. Financial records were audited, enforcement logs reviewed, and policies rewritten to align with governing documents that had long been treated as flexible suggestions rather than binding rules. The HOA president's frustration became more visible, her emails shorter and less polished, her public demeanor strained by the loss of unilateral control. Residents noticed the change, interpreting it not as resilience but as resistance to accountability. Conversations that once centered on fear of fines now revolved around governance models, term limits, and the role of community input, signaling a profound shift in priorities. My wife remained largely silent in these discussions, contributing only when clarity was needed, her restraint reinforcing her credibility. She understood that leadership sometimes meant knowing when not to lead, allowing others to step forward and redefine the community's direction. As reforms took shape, the HOA president found herself increasingly sidelined, her influence diluted by oversight requirements and collective decision-making. Board members began to assert independence, questioning directives and insisting on documented justification, a practice that slowed decision-making but increased legitimacy. The neighborhood's atmosphere evolved again, this time into something cautiously optimistic, as residents glimpsed the possibility of governance rooted in fairness rather than fear. The process was not without conflict. Old grievances surfaced, and debates grew heated, but the tone had changed. Disagreement no longer carried the threat of retribution, and that freedom transformed how people engaged. The HOA president's attempts to reframe the narrative as an external attack on community autonomy failed to gain traction, undermined by the transparency now demanded at every level. The oversight body's periodic updates reinforced the seriousness of compliance, reminding the board that reform was not optional but mandatory. My wife continued to document developments, aware that institutional memory was crucial in preventing regression once scrutiny eased. She recognized familiar patterns in the resistance to change, the tendency of entrenched authority to interpret accountability as persecution, and she remained patient, trusting the process she knew so well. As weeks turned into months, the cumulative effect of oversight became undeniable. Policies were revised, enforcement standardized, and channels for resident input formalized, each change chipping away at the culture of intimidation that had defined the HOA for so long. The HOA president's role diminished further, her authority constrained by checks she could not circumvent. Whispers of resignation circulated, though nothing was confirmed, and the uncertainty surrounding her future added to the sense of transition permeating the neighborhood. Residents began to imagine what governance might look like without the constant tension that had once seemed inevitable. The transformation was incomplete and fragile, but it was real, built not on confrontation, but on sustained scrutiny and participation. My wife remained grounded throughout, aware that the true test would come when oversight eventually receded, and the community would have to sustain its own standards without external enforcement. The driveway incident that had sparked this chain of events now felt distant, almost mundane compared to the systemic changes unfolding, yet its significance was impossible to ignore. It had exposed the fragility of assumed authority and demonstrated the power of measured accountability. As the HOA prepared for upcoming elections under revised rules, the neighborhood stood on the threshold of a new chapter, one defined not by fear of enforcement, but by the responsibility of self-governance, and as anticipation built around what those elections might bring, it was clear that the story was approaching a pivotal moment, one that would determine whether the lessons learned would endure or fade into memory in the chapters still to come. The announcement of upcoming elections under the revised rules marked a turning point that felt both empowering and unsettling, as though the neighborhood had been handed a tool it had never been trusted with before. The oversight body's requirements transformed what had once been a predictable formality into a genuinely contested process, complete with clear nomination procedures, transparent voting mechanisms, and strict limits on the concentration of authority. For many residents, the idea of participating in HOA governance without fear of retaliation was unfamiliar territory, and that unfamiliarity bred a mix of enthusiasm and hesitation. Informal conversations began to coalesce into organized discussions, with neighbors exchanging ideas about what leadership should look like in a community that had long been governed through intimidation rather than consent. The HOA president's response to the election announcement was outwardly measured but inwardly strained, her public statements emphasizing continuity and experience, while her private communications grew increasingly insistent on loyalty. The contrast did not go unnoticed. Board members who had once aligned themselves unquestioningly with her leadership now faced a choice that carried real consequences, and many chose to step back rather than be drawn into a contest defined by the past. My wife observed the early stages of this shift with quiet attentiveness, aware that transitions of power often revealed as much about a community's values as the policies it adopted. She understood that the true challenge was not removing a single figure, but dismantling the culture that had enabled unchecked authority to flourish. As nominations opened, a surprising number of residents stepped forward, some motivated by frustration, others by a genuine desire to rebuild trust. Their statements focused less on enforcement and more on transparency, fairness, and communication, signaling a profound departure from the rhetoric that had once dominated HOA discourse. The HOA president's campaign, by contrast, leaned heavily on warnings about disorder and decline, invoking the familiar specter of chaos that had long justified strict control. Yet the narrative felt dated, out of step with a neighborhood that had already experienced the consequences of overreach. Meetings in the weeks leading up to the election were marked by spirited debate, not the hushed compliance of the past, and that energy itself became a measure of progress. Residents asked pointed questions about enforcement practices, financial stewardship, and accountability mechanisms, and candidates responded with varying degrees of clarity and conviction. My wife attended these meetings quietly, her presence unobtrusive but steady, offering occasional clarifications when discussions veered into misinformation. She understood the importance of accuracy in moments like these, recognizing how easily fear could be reignited through half-truths. The oversight body maintained a visible but neutral presence, reinforcing procedural integrity without influencing outcomes, a balance that underscored the seriousness of the process. As Election Day approached, tensions sharpened, particularly around the HOA president, whose authority had already been constrained by oversight, and whose future now depended on a vote she could not control. Her attempts to mobilize support through personal appeals and selective reminders of past favors only highlighted the transactional nature of her leadership. Neighbors who had once felt indebted now questioned whether those favors had come at the cost of fairness. The election itself unfolded with an air of quiet determination, ballots cast with deliberation rather than resignation. The process was transparent, the counting observed, the results announced without ceremony, but with unmistakable significance. The HOA president did not secure the majority she had assumed was hers, her influence diluted by a community that had learned to question rather than defer. The new board reflected a cross-section of the neighborhood, its members united less by ideology than by a shared commitment to accountability. The transition was not triumphant but sober, marked by an awareness of the work ahead. The outgoing leadership's departure was formal and restrained, though the tension beneath the surface was palpable. My wife watched the results with a measured calm, aware that change on paper did not guarantee change in practice. She understood that institutional habits were resilient, and that vigilance would be required to prevent regression once the immediacy of oversight faded. The new board's first actions were deliberately cautious, focusing on stabilizing operations and reaffirming commitments to transparency. Policies were reviewed, communication channels formalized, and enforcement protocols standardized, each step reinforcing the shift away from arbitrary authority. The neighborhood responded with cautious optimism, participation increasing as residents tested the sincerity of these changes. The HOA president's absence created a vacuum that felt both relieving and disorienting, a reminder of how much space her presence had occupied for so long. Conversations about community values grew more nuanced, less reactive, as the immediate threat of punitive enforcement receded. My wife remained engaged without dominating, offering guidance when requested and stepping back when appropriate. Her approach, reinforcing the principle that sustainable change required collective ownership. As the new board settled into its role, challenges emerged, from budget constraints to lingering mistrust. But the willingness to address them openly marked a decisive break from the past. The oversight body's continued involvement ensured that reforms were implemented as promised, providing a safety net that allowed the community to experiment with a more collaborative model of governance. The driveway incident that had set this transformation in motion now seemed like a distant catalyst, its significance understood only in retrospect, yet its lessons remained embedded in the community's consciousness, shaping how authority was perceived and exercised. As the neighborhood adjusted to this new reality, the story entered a quieter phase, one less defined by confrontation and more by consolidation, setting the stage for a deeper exploration of whether accountability could endure once the spotlight shifted in the chapters that followed. With initial turbulence of the election behind them, the neighborhood entered a period that felt deceptively calm, a phase where the absence of overt conflict masked the complexity of rebuilding trust after years of quiet coercion. The new board's meetings were orderly and methodical, their tone intentionally restrained, as if any hint of assertiveness might be mistaken for a return to the past. Agendas were published in advance, minutes circulated promptly, and decisions explained in plain language, small but significant departures from the opacity that had once defined HOA governance. Residents responded cautiously, attending meetings in steady numbers but holding back judgment, watching for signs that these changes were more than performative. My wife recognized this phase well, understanding that accountability was often tested not during crises but during periods of relative stability when vigilance tended to fade. She continued to observe, documenting decisions and noting whether procedures aligned with the reforms mandated by oversight, aware that institutional memory could erode quickly without deliberate preservation. The oversight body's involvement began to scale back, shifting from active supervision to periodic check-ins, a transition that placed greater responsibility on the board to regulate. That shift introduced a new kind of pressure, one that could not be deflected by blaming external scrutiny. The board members grappled with the weight of this responsibility, balancing the desire to move forward with the need to address unresolved grievances that still simmered beneath the surface. Some residents pushed for swift reforms, eager to erase the legacy of the previous administration, while others advocated for incremental change, wary of destabilizing a system that, despite its flaws, still maintained essential functions. The tension between urgency and caution played out in meetings that stretched longer than planned, marked by thoughtful debate rather than the abrupt dismissals of the past. Former HOA presidents' presence lingered in subtler ways, not through direct involvement, but through habits and expectations that were hard to unlearn. Enforcement officers accustomed to discretionary power struggled to adapt to standardized protocols, occasionally reverting to old patterns that sparked immediate pushback from residents now attuned to their rights. Each such incident became a test, an opportunity to demonstrate whether the new governance model could correct itself without external intervention. My wife watched these moments closely, offering guidance only when necessary, her restraint reinforcing the principle that sustainable accountability required systems rather than individuals. The board's willingness to address missteps openly became a defining feature of this period, signaling a commitment to transparency even when it was uncomfortable. Financial reviews revealed areas where previous practices had prioritized expedience over compliance, and rectifying those issues required difficult conversations about budgets, reserves, and long-term planning. Residents accustomed to reacting to fines now found themselves discussing fiscal responsibility and collective priorities, a shift that reframed the HOA role from enforcer to steward. Trust, however, proved slower to rebuild than procedures. Longtime residents carried the memory of arbitrary penalties and public confrontations, their skepticism rooted in lived experience rather than cynicism. The board acknowledged this openly, resisting the urge to demand confidence before it had been earned. Community forums were organized not to dictate outcomes but to listen, and while attendance varied, the mere existence of these spaces represented a meaningful departure from the past. My wife attended some of these forums quietly, her presence a reminder of the catalyst that had sparked change, though she never claimed credit or authority. She understood that narratives of heroism could undermine collective ownership, and she remained focused on reinforcing processes rather than personalities. As months passed, the neighborhood's rhythm adjusted, the constant undercurrent of fear giving way to cautious engagement. Residents began to experiment with participation, volunteering for committees, proposing initiatives, and testing the boundaries of this new openness. The board's response to these efforts became a barometer of its sincerity, and while not every proposal was adopted, each was acknowledged with respect. The oversight body's periodic updates confirmed that compliance remained on track, reinforcing the legitimacy of the reforms and providing reassurance that regression would not go unnoticed. Yet the absence of daily conflict introduced a new challenge: complacency. Attendance at meetings began to dip, and discussions occasionally drifted toward convenience rather than principle. My wife recognized this as a critical juncture, the moment when the lessons of the past risked being diluted by the comfort of the present. She quietly encouraged documentation and continuity, emphasizing the importance of institutional memory in preventing the reemergence of unchecked authority. The board responded by formalizing policies that embedded transparency into routine operations, reducing reliance on individual goodwill. These measures included standardized enforcement logs, rotating leadership roles, and clear avenues for resident appeals, each designed to outlast the current administration. The former HOA president's influence continued to wane, her absence gradually becoming normalized, though occasional references to her tenure surfaced as cautionary tales rather than rallying cries. The neighborhood's identity began to shift, no longer defined by opposition to a single figure, but by an evolving understanding of shared responsibility. My wife observed this transformation with guarded optimism, aware that progress was rarely linear and that setbacks were inevitable. She understood that the true measure of change would emerge not in dramatic confrontations, but in mundane decisions made without oversight or spectacle. As the community settled into this new phase, the driveway incident that had ignited everything felt increasingly distant, its significance now woven into the fabric of collective memory rather than daily conversation. Yet its lessons remained relevant, informing how residents interpreted authority and how leaders exercised it. The calm that settled over the neighborhood was not the silence of suppression, but the quiet of cautious balance, a state that required ongoing attention to sustain. As the oversight body prepared to conclude its involvement entirely, the community faced a final test: whether it could maintain accountability without external pressure. The answer was not yet clear, but the groundwork had been laid, and as the neighborhood stood on the threshold of full autonomy, the story moved toward its resolution, poised to explore whether the changes achieved could endure beyond the shadow of their origins in the chapters that remained. Oversight body's final notice arrived with a tone of measured confidence, acknowledging sustained compliance and signaling the conclusion of external supervision, a milestone that carried both validation and vulnerability. For the neighborhood, this moment represented more than bureaucratic closure. It marked the transition from reform under observation to self-governance by choice. The new board framed the announcement as a collective achievement, emphasizing the role of resident engagement in driving change. And while the sentiment was broadly accepted, it also stirred unease among those who remembered how quickly authority had once consolidated in the absence of scrutiny. My wife recognized the significance of this juncture, aware that the absence of oversight often tested the resilience of newly established norms. She continued to document developments quietly, not out of distrust, but out of respect for the fragility of institutional change. The board responded to the conclusion of supervision by reaffirming its commitments in a public statement, outlining ongoing transparency measures and inviting residents to hold leadership accountable through established channels. Attendance at meetings fluctuated, reflecting the natural ebb and flow of civic engagement. Yet the mechanisms for participation remained intact, a crucial distinction from the past. The neighborhood's focus gradually shifted from rectifying old wrongs to navigating everyday governance challenges, from maintenance decisions to long-term planning, issues that lacked the dramatic clarity of conflict but demanded consistent attention. In this quieter context, the legacy of the former HOA president resurfaced intermittently, not as an active force, but as a point of comparison that shaped expectations. Residents were quick to notice deviations from established procedures, and even minor lapses prompted discussion, a testament to how deeply the lessons of the past had been internalized. The board's willingness to address these concerns openly reinforced trust, though it also exposed the strain of sustaining transparency without external prompts. My wife observed these dynamics with a critical eye, recognizing patterns that could either fortify or undermine progress depending on how they were handled. She understood that governance fatigue was a real risk, that the absence of crisis could lull communities into complacency. To counter this, she encouraged the preservation of records and the rotation of responsibilities, measures designed to prevent the concentration of power that had once gone unchecked. The board adopted these suggestions, embedding them into formal policy to ensure continuity beyond individual tenures. Meanwhile, the former HOA president's absence became less a point of relief and more a footnote, her influence receding as new norms took root. Occasional attempts to reinsert herself into neighborhood discourse, often through informal channels, were met with polite but firm boundaries, a clear indication that the community had outgrown the dynamics that once defined it. The neighborhood's evolving identity was reflected in its conversations, which now centered on collaboration rather than compliance. Disagreements still arose, but they were framed as differences of perspective rather than challenges to authority, a subtle but meaningful shift. My wife's role in this phase was largely observational, her earlier interventions giving way to trust in the systems now in place. She remained available as a resource, but she resisted the temptation to influence outcomes directly, understanding that sustainable governance required distributed ownership. As months passed, the memory of the driveway incident that had ignited this transformation faded further into the background, its significance preserved in documentation and shared understanding rather than daily discourse. New residents arrived, unaware of the conflicts that had shaped the neighborhood's evolution, and their integration tested the board's ability to communicate values without relying on fear or precedent. Orientation materials were updated to reflect the emphasis on transparency and participation, ensuring that the lessons learned were passed on rather than assumed. The board's success in this effort became a quiet indicator of how deeply change had been institutionalized. My wife noted these developments with cautious optimism, aware that the true measure of reform lay in its ability to endure generational shifts. The neighborhood's atmosphere continued to stabilize, the undercurrent of tension replaced by a sense of shared responsibility that felt both unfamiliar and promising. Yet, even in this relative calm, she remained attentive to subtle signals of drift, knowing that power had a way of accumulating when vigilance waned. The community's resilience was tested not by overt conflict, but by the mundane challenges of decision-making without a common adversary. In navigating these challenges, the board demonstrated a growing maturity, learning to balance efficiency with inclusivity and authority with accountability. The conclusion of oversight marked the end of one chapter in the neighborhood story, but it also set the stage for a deeper question: whether the changes achieved through confrontation and scrutiny could be sustained through routine and trust. As the community settled into this new normal, the final chapter loomed, poised to reflect on the journey from coercion to collaboration, and to consider what the driveway incident ultimately revealed about power, accountability, and the quiet strength of restraint. Time did what conflict never could, smoothing the sharp edges of memory while preserving its lessons in quieter, more durable ways. The neighborhood no longer measured itself against the chaos it had escaped, but against the standards it had chosen to uphold, a shift that revealed how deeply the transformation had taken root. Governance became less of a spectacle and more of a routine responsibility, its success measured not by the absence of dissent, but by the presence of process. Meetings continued, sometimes sparsely attended, sometimes full, yet always documented, always open, always grounded in the expectation that authority required explanation. The systems put in place during oversight proved resilient, not because they were perfect, but because they distributed responsibility rather than concentrating it. My wife watched this evolution with a sense of quiet completion, aware that her role had always been catalytic rather than central. She had never sought recognition or control, understanding that sustainable change rarely belonged to those who initiated it, but to those who maintained it. The former HOA president's name surfaced only occasionally now, referenced less as a villain than as a cautionary example of what unchecked authority could become when insulated from accountability. Her influence had dissolved into irrelevance, not through confrontation, but through replacement by better structures. New leaders emerged over time, shaped not by fear of enforcement, but by familiarity with transparency, their legitimacy rooted in participation rather than intimidation. The neighborhood's culture reflected this shift in subtle ways, from the tone of emails to the conduct of enforcement officers, who now operated within clearly defined limits. Residents who had once avoided interaction with the HOA began to see it as a forum rather than a threat, a place where disagreements could be aired without fear of retaliation. My wife recognized these changes as signs of maturity, evidence that the community had internalized the principles that oversight had temporarily imposed. The driveway incident that had sparked everything now felt almost mundane in retrospect, its significance residing not in the confrontation itself, but in what it revealed about the fragility of assumed authority. That moment, when a routine call intersected with professional restraint and accountability, had exposed the gap between power claimed and power justified. The officer's pause, my wife's composure, and the HOA president's overreach had converged to create a rupture that allowed long, suppressed truths to surface. Over time, those truths reshaped not just policies but relationships, redefining how neighbors perceived one another and the institutions meant to serve them. New residents moved in unaware of the history, yet they inherited its outcomes in the form of transparent processes and participatory norms. Orientation packets and welcome meetings emphasized collaboration, framing governance as a shared endeavor rather than a hierarchy to be feared. The community's ability to integrate newcomers without reverting to old habits became a quiet affirmation of its growth. My wife observed these developments with the satisfaction of someone who understood that the most meaningful victories were often invisible, embedded in routines rather than headlines. She remained vigilant without being watchful, trusting the systems she had helped reinforce while staying attuned to the subtle shifts that signaled potential drift. The neighborhood story, once defined by tension and control, now unfolded through mundane decisions about maintenance, schedules, budgets, and community events, the very ordinariness of which testified to the success of reform. Accountability no longer required external validation. It had become an expectation woven into daily practice. The final measure of change emerged not in moments of conflict, but in the absence of fear, in the ease with which residents engaged one another and their leaders. The Hoa, once a symbol of coercion, had become an imperfect but functional mechanism for collective decision-making. My wife's credentials, once the silent disruptor that froze a responding officer, now rested unnoticed in her bag, their significance transformed from immediate authority to quiet assurance. The journey from that driveway to this moment had been neither linear nor simple, but it had demonstrated the power of restraint, documentation, and patience in confronting overreach. The neighborhood stood as evidence that authority, when examined, could be reshaped rather than merely resisted. As life returned fully to its ordinary rhythms, the lesson endured in subtle ways. Power derived its legitimacy not from volume or intimidation, but from accountability and trust. The story did not end with triumph or defeat, but with equilibrium, a state sustained through collective vigilance rather than individual dominance. And in that balance, the community found something it had long been denied, a sense of ownership over its own governance, forged not through confrontation alone, but through the quiet, persistent insistence that authority answer to those it claimed to serve.